Shalom Aleichem. I'm doing this tape in honor of my father, Solomon Zynstein, Shlomo Zynstein, who would have been 95 today had he lived, who passed away 10 years ago on Tisha B'Av in 1998, and who was a Holocaust survivor who worked all his life on behalf of the Jewish people and the state of Israel as an artist, as a reporter, as a political figure, as a writer, as a fashion designer. He was truly a Renaissance man in the Jewish tradition, and he would be proud that that all of the things that he has done in his life are still being remembered. And I'm also talking today because it's the week of the Shoah, and in memory of my mother, Rachel Zynstein, who was the only woman who managed to save a child in the year 1942 in the area of Transnistria, Russia, which was the designated place for killing all the Jewish children and the designated year for annihilating the children. And she had the courage to run away from a ghetto called Brailov, where my parents and my mother, father, grandmother, 3 uncles and 2 aunts were living and working in a clothing factory that my father had organized to keep themselves alive when my father found out that the Germans were planning to kill all the women and children. And a plan was made for my mother to run away to a neighboring ghetto in Romania, which was safer because the Romanian government was not giving up the Jews at that point. And my mother ran away when she was 9 months pregnant with me, with the help, from the help of a Russian school teacher who used to come into the ghetto and help the Jews make plans to escape. And she brought my mother out in the middle of the night, and she took her 8 miles through a stream and through the woods into the neighboring ghetto, the Zmerinka ghetto, where she was taken in front of the Judenrat, which is the Jews who were governing the ghetto, who made all the life and death decisions. And the head of the Judenrat's name, the man's name was Mr. Hirschman. And at first he didn't want my mother to be saved when he saw her condition, because it was a crime to deliver a Jewish baby. And he knew that crime was punishable by death. But my mother started pleading for her life, and she started talking about how in the past so many nations wanted to destroy the Jews, but they were still alive and they were still practicing their faith. And finally he relented and said she could be saved on one condition. The condition would be if it was a girl named after his mother and a boy named after his father. So my mother was taken to an area that had been used as a synagogue in Zmerinka, into the basement there, and that's where I was born. And I was named Frida after Mr. Hirschman's mother. But the name Frida also began to symbolize the word freedom for my parents and for all those who knew that I had survived. And a few days later, my mother's family escaped from Brailov to Zmerinka to be with my mother. And they all were hiding, but the Germans followed. Because when they came to do their action, most of the Jews were gone. So they found out where they had run to, and they followed them, and they tricked them into coming out into the streets. And finally, they forced my mother and father and her family out. And the German general, who my father had been making a uniform for, a white uniform, recognized my father, and he said, "This is the man I want. He has to stay alive to finish the uniform." This general just wanted to keep a tailor alive for his uniform and a shoemaker for his shoes, and everybody else he didn't care about. Everyone else would perish. So he then, when he recognized my father, he said to my father, "We need you." And my mother was there. My father said, "I have my family. I need my family to stay with me." And the German looked at everyone. He said, which is your family? And they all stepped out, and he said, "It's too big a family, and we can't keep everybody alive." And he went like this, and whoever was on this side stayed alive, whoever was on the other side was taken away. So on that day, they took away my grandmother, 2 aunts, and an uncle. And that's the story of how I was born. And then I survived in the Zhymaninka ghetto. We were liberated in 1945 by the Russians. And then we went to DP camps. We lived 2 years in a DP camp in Bamberg, Germany. Well, my father was very active in establishing a Yiddish theater there, and taught in Yiddish schools, and was a photographer and worked for a Yiddish newspaper. He was a newspaper man. He was a photojournalist. He developed all his own pictures. I used to wait for him to come home because we had a little dark room set up. And for me, it was like magic. He would put a white piece of paper in some water and then magic, and it would develop into something. And I used to love to see that. And some of the pictures I have here today and are being shown in the Riverdale Review.
Okay.